An arrogant billionaire smirked as he outbid everyone, certain that the masterpiece belonged to him. Then, a black woman in the back of the room raised her hand, and in an instant, the entire auction flipped upside down. The grand auction hall shimmered under the golden chandeliers, the air thick with wealth and exclusivity. Men in tailored suits and women draped in designer gowns sipped champagne as they whispered among themselves, their conversations laced with arrogance and certainty. This was not just any auction. It was an event where only the elite dared to bid, a place where fortunes were spent on art that most would never truly understand. And then, she walked in. A black woman in a sleek but understated dress, her natural curls framing a face that held an unreadable expression. She was elegant, yet something about her presence felt out of place. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, and then came the smirks. The silent judgment passed with each glance. She didn't belong here. At least, that's what they thought. A young server, balancing a tray of crystal glasses, nearly stumbled when he saw her. His eyes flickered with recognition, his lips parting, as if to say something, but he quickly caught himself. No one else seemed to notice, or rather, no one else cared. At the front of the room, a towering man in a dark blue suit, Jonathan Carlisle, a billionaire art collector with an insatiable hunger for dominance, exchanged amused whispers with his associates. He leaned back, swirling the golden liquid in his glass, before shooting a glance in her direction. "Lost, are we?" someone murmured behind her, just loud enough for her to hear. She didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor, unfazed by the weight of their stares. She moved with a quiet confidence, the kind that unsettled those who thrived on intimidation. The auctioneer cleared his throat, tapping the microphone to draw attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Tonight, we have a collection of rare and exquisite pieces, each more valuable than the last. But among them, there is one that stands above all, an original piece from the lost collection of Etienne Moreau, estimated to be worth over $60 million. A collective murmur swept through the room. Even among the wealthy, this was no ordinary acquisition. Moreau's lost collection was the holy grail of the art world. Owning one of his works was not just about money. It was about legacy, about power. Carlisle smirked, adjusting his cufflinks. He already knew the painting was his. He had outbid kings and oligarchs before. Tonight would be no different. But across the room, the woman remained silent, her gaze fixed on the stage where the painting was about to be unveiled. She exhaled softly, running her fingers over the delicate gold bracelet on her wrist. A simple but striking piece, engraved with initials that only a handful of people in the world would recognize. For now, no one paid her any mind. That was about to change. As the velvet curtain was drawn back, the gasps in the room were almost immediate. The painting was magnificent, an ethereal masterpiece of swirling blues and golds, a composition so mesmerizing that even the most jaded collectors leaned forward in awe. The lost Moreau, the crown jewel of the evening. Jonathan Carlisle's smirk widened. His competition tonight would be fierce, but he welcomed it. It made his inevitable victory even sweeter. He glanced around, scanning the faces in the room, assessing who was worth his attention and who was merely here for the spectacle. His gaze barely paused on her. The auctioneer raised his gavel. "We'll start the bidding at $20 million. A paddle shot up instantly. Carlisle's. He didn't wait. He never did. His presence alone was often enough to intimidate lesser bidders into silence. 25. Another voice called. 30. The numbers climbed swiftly, each bid a casual nod from men who could afford to gamble fortunes on a whim. Carlisle remained relaxed, raising the stakes effortlessly, each counterbid laced with an almost playful arrogance. And then, for the first time that night, she raised her hand. 40 million. A ripple of silence spread through the crowd, followed by a murmur of amusement. A few exchanged knowing glances. Someone chuckled under their breath. It was one thing to attend an event like this. It was another to actually bid. Carlisle's head turned ever so slightly in her direction, as if just now registering her existence. His smirk didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps. 45, he said smoothly, almost dismissively. 50. Laughter. This time, it wasn't discreet. A man in the front row leaned over to his companion, shaking his head in amusement. She's serious? Someone whispered. Maybe she's here on behalf of a real buyer. Another murmured. The auctioneer hesitated, glancing between them. He was used to high-stakes battles, but there was something about this moment, about her, that felt different. Carlisle exhaled through his nose, feigning amusement. 55. She didn't even blink. 60. This time the reaction wasn't just amusement, it was disbelief. Carlisle's smirk hardened, the edges of his confidence beginning to fray. He straightened, finally looking at her with real interest. You know, sweetheart, he said casually, his voice carrying just enough condescension to make the crowd chuckle. This isn't the kind of place where you raise your hand just to get attention. A few people laughed outright. Someone clinked their glass against another in mock cheers. She met his gaze, unshaken. Neither is a boardroom, Mr. Carlisle. And yet, here you are. A hush fell over the room. The smirk on his face flickered, just for a second. She knew exactly who he was, just as well as he didn't know who she was. The auctioneer, sensing the tension, cleared his throat. The bid stands at 60 million. Do I hear 65? Carlisle hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, but in a room like this, with an audience like this, hesitation was a weakness. 65, he finally said, but the confidence in his voice had shifted. It was no longer effortless. It was defensive. She raised her hand again. 70. The room collectively inhaled. Carlisle's jaw clenched. He was a man who thrived on control, on being the one who dictated the rules of the game. This was not how the game was supposed to go. He turned slightly, murmuring something to his assistant, who immediately pulled out a phone. He was checking, confirming, that she was bluffing, that she had to be bluffing. She wasn't. 75. His voice was tighter now. The entire auction house was locked on them. No one else dared to speak, dared to move. This was no longer about the painting. This was a war. She let the silence stretch just long enough before she raised her hand, one last time. 80 million. A single gasp, sharp and unrestrained, echoed through the room. The tension was suffocating. Carlisle didn't move. His fingers curled against the armrest of his chair, his smirk now completely gone. He was calculating, weighing his pride against his wallet, against the humiliation of backing down. The auctioneer waited. Mr. Carlisle? The billionaire exhaled slowly, then leaned back, jaw tight. I'm out. And just like that, the entire power dynamic in the room shifted. The moment Carlisle leaned back and uttered those words, a ripple went through the crowd. The collective disbelief was almost tangible. Jonathan Carlisle, one of the most ruthless, relentless collectors in the art world, had just backed down. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice slightly unsteady. 80 million going once, going twice. Sold. The gavel struck the podium, but the sound was drowned out by the murmur that followed. The woman, still nameless to them, still an enigma, remained seated, unbothered by the weight of 100 stares pressing into her. It was as if she had expected this outcome all along. The servers, the auction house staff, even the security guards exchanged glances, their carefully composed professionalism slipping as they tried to process what had just happened. Carlisle exhaled sharply through his nose, a muscle in his jaw twitching. He was used to winning. When he lost, it was on his terms, never because someone else took what he wanted, and certainly not because of a woman, an unknown woman, who had walked into this room as if she belonged, and now had the audacity to walk out with his painting. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath. His associates sat stiffly, their earlier amusement now replaced with discomfort. They had laughed, mocked, and now? Now they had just watched their leader get outmaneuvered in front of everyone. "Who is she?" one of them whispered. Carlisle didn't answer. He was already pulling out his phone, dialing a number with precise, irritated movements. Someone would find out. Someone had to find out. Meanwhile, the woman stood, smoothing the fabric of her dress, her every movement deliberate, controlled. A server, the server who had recognized her earlier, hurried to open the door for her. His hands trembled slightly as he did. She offered him a polite nod before stepping past, completely ignoring the murmurs that followed in her wake. But she didn't make it far. "Miss." Carlisle's voice cut through the air like a blade. The room quieted instantly. She paused, tilting her head slightly before turning back. He was standing now, his frame imposing, his expression composed, but his eyes burning with something darker. Not just frustration, not just curiosity, a challenge. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure of an introduction," he said smoothly, though the sharp edge beneath his words was impossible to miss. The crowd held its breath. She studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether or not he was worth her time. Then, with the faintest smile, she responded, "No, we haven't." She turned again, fully intending to leave. Carlisle took a step forward. "You've made quite the statement tonight." She stopped. The room, once buzzing with hushed conversations, had fallen completely silent. It was no longer about the auction. It was about them, about the power struggle that had been set in motion the moment she raised her paddle. Slowly she pivoted back to face him. "A statement?" she echoed, as if amused by the word. "I thought I was simply purchasing a painting." A few people shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't how women usually spoke to Jonathan Carlisle. They flirted, they fawned, they yielded. She did none of those things. His lips curved into something resembling a smile, but his eyes remained cold. $80 million is quite the investment for someone I've never heard of before." Her expression remained unreadable. "Perhaps you should expand your circles." A low murmur rippled through the room. Someone stifled a chuckle. Carlisle's fingers curled slightly at his sides. "You clearly know who I am," he said, voice controlled but firm. "I do. And yet, I have no idea who you are." "That," she said lightly, "isn't my problem." It was the way she said it. Effortless, unbothered, like she was speaking to someone utterly insignificant. Carlisle's smile vanished entirely. For years, he had built his reputation on being untouchable. He dictated the terms of every negotiation, controlled the power dynamics in every room. And yet, right now, in front of everyone, he was losing. Not just the painting, not just the money, the moment, the narrative, the control. And the worst part? She knew it. She turned once more, walking towards the exit with a grace that was both effortless and commanding. No hesitation, no second glance. Carlisle's associates looked at him, waiting for his next move. He did nothing, said nothing, because for the first time in a very long time, he had no move to make. And as the doors closed behind her, sealing off the stunned silence of the auction house, a single thought burned in his mind. Who the hell was she? The auction house remained eerily silent, even after she had disappeared through the grand doors. It was as if the very walls still held the weight of what had just transpired. No one moved. No one dared to. Jonathan Carlisle's jaw was set, his fingers gripping the edge of his glass so tightly it seemed like it might shatter. He had just been humiliated, not by a rival he knew, not by a billionaire with a name as powerful as his, but by a woman he had never even heard of. That, more than anything, was what burned the most. Find out who she is. His voice was quiet but sharp, a blade pressed against the silence. His assistant, already tapping feverishly on his phone, paled as he skimmed through whatever he had just discovered. Sir. He hesitated, as if unsure how to proceed. Carlisle turned to him, his patience non-existent. What? The assistant swallowed hard. Her name is Naomi Ellis. The name meant nothing to him. He had never heard it before. But then the assistant continued. Daughter of Charles Ellis. And just like that, the entire auction house seemed to shift. Carlisle's breath hitched for half a second, a fraction of hesitation that no one but his closest advisors would have noticed. The murmurs in the room grew louder now, those who recognized the name exchanging stunned glances. Charles Ellis, the legendary art collector, a man whose influence had once shaped the very fabric of the industry before he vanished from the public eye. There had always been rumors, whispers that his collection was hidden away, that his empire had not crumbled, but rather been passed down. And now, standing before them, was the heir to it all. You mean to tell me, Carlisle said slowly, his voice dangerously low, that the woman I just lost to is the daughter of Charles Ellis? His assistant nodded stiffly. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had underestimated her, not just in wealth, but in power, in legacy. The moment he had dismissed her as nothing, he had already lost, and she had known it. She had walked into that auction house knowing exactly what would happen, knowing how they would laugh, how they would doubt her. She had played her role perfectly, letting them believe she was insignificant, only to tear down their illusions with a single raised hand. It hadn't just been about the painting. It had been about him. A move made with precision, a strike designed to shake the very foundation of his control. Carlisle's lips pressed into a thin line. His associates were already whispering, some clearly entertained by the turn of events. Others, less so. He had just been outplayed, and in a world where perception was everything, that was a blow he couldn't afford. But then, as the realization settled, something flickered in his eyes. Something dark, something calculated. This wasn't over. Naomi Ellis had made her move. Now, it was his turn. The story spread like wildfire. By the time Naomi Ellis stepped out of the auction house and into the waiting black car, the headlines had already begun to form. The woman who humiliated Jonathan Carlisle. Naomi Ellis, the heiress no one saw coming. Power shift in the art world, and it's just the beginning. Inside the hall, Carlisle sat motionless, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. The room still buzzed, hushed conversations threading through the air like static. Some avoided his gaze, others watched him carefully, waiting to see how he would react. But he didn't explode. didn't storm out. No, that wasn't his style. He had built his empire on control, and he refused to let anyone see the fury burning beneath his skin. Instead, he exhaled, slow and measured, before rising from his seat. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, straightening his cufflinks, "enjoy the rest of your evening." And with that, he strode out, leaving behind the remnants of his first public loss in years. Naomi, meanwhile, sat in the back of her car, the city lights flickering past in a golden blur. She wasn't checking her phone, wasn't basking in the victory. She simply gazed out the window, fingers tracing the engraved initials on her bracelet, her father's. "You would have enjoyed that, wouldn't you?" she murmured to herself. A small smile touched her lips. Tonight had been necessary, a statement, a warning. Carlisle and his kind had ruled this world unchecked for too long, believing power belonged only to those who had always held it. But that time was over. The painting was just the beginning. As Naomi's car disappeared into the city night, the world around her continued to shift. Inside the auction house, the weight of what had happened still lingered. Whispers of her name growing louder, speculation running wild. But she wasn't concerned with any of that. Her phone buzzed beside her. A message. Impressive move. He won't forget it. She didn't need to check the sender. She already knew. Jonathan Carlisle wasn't the kind of man to let a loss go unanswered. But that was fine. She hadn't come here to play it safe. She had come to change the game entirely. Naomi leaned back against the leather seat, exhaling slowly. The auction, the money, the spectacle, it had all been necessary. But in the end, what mattered wasn't just proving a point. It was making sure no one ever doubted her again. And they wouldn't. Not after tonight. Power is an illusion, until someone comes along and shatters it. Naomi Ellis did exactly that, and now the entire art world was paying attention. So, what do you think? Was this just a battle of wealth, or was it something bigger? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you would have done in her place. And if you love stories of power shifts, unexpected victories, and game-changing moments, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There's plenty more where this came from. After all, the best stories, they're the ones you never see coming.